When we first started Soul, that really was our vision. The Society for Organizational Learning, that it would be a vehicle for fostering community in different geographies, and then a community of different geographies. So people from many different places can come together. I don't recall exactly, but when we had the global forum here 4 years ago, there were probably about 20 or more countries represented.
30.
35. 35. Elaine will recall correctly. So that was always the vision of Soul. And the reason for this is very simple. Learning is a community activity. We all learn individually, but our learning is always embedded, connected to a larger community, whether we're aware of it or not. So we learn to walk in a community of walkers. We learn to ride our bicycles because other children are riding bicycles. Obviously, language, in some ways, the most basic learning process for a human being in our lifetimes, the complexity, the sophistication of developing facility in natural language is by its definition in a community. So this is a part of learning that's often not evident to everybody, because we're very aware when we have to learn the challenges we face, the difficulties, the process of learning at the personal level is very evident to us. What's often not so visible is the larger community. And in today's world, that's more important than ever, because the challenges we face, either for individual organizations or, of course, for our societies, are ones that clearly require collective learning. Both collections of individuals in various networks and teams, but also collections of organizations, and ultimately even collections of societies. Although our societies are very different, and around the world, the conditions that we develop our societies in are very, very different. Today, more than ever, the challenges are the same. The core challenges that all of our societies face. Inclusion, equity, the opportunities for all. We have probably very common ideals that a healthy society is healthy precisely because it creates opportunities for everybody. But of course, the gap between that aspiration and the reality, if anything, grows around the world in all societies. The fundamental gap between human and nature sits behind all these problems. All of our societies through the industrial age have drifted further and further away from feeling connected to a larger natural world. It's interesting that today, probably in many of our minds, foreground in our minds, is the political reality, the state of our democracies around the world. But what we don't realize is in many ways the inspiration for democracy comes from the natural world, not the human world. No one is in charge of a force. Ecosystems govern themselves. The emergence of kind of collective intelligence is a natural phenomenon. One of the most beautiful articulations of the principles of democracy are in an essay written about 160 years ago by a man named Walt Whitman, very famous American poet and essayist. And he wrote a little essay titled On Democracy. And in the key lines of the essay, he says, "We have often spoken the word democracy, but it is a word the real meaning of which still sleeps, unawakened. Younger brother of another great word, whose meaning also still sleeps, nature." So as human beings become more and more separated from the natural world, our understanding of the fundamentals, you might say the organic or biological fundamentals of democracy also weakens. And we're left with rules, regulations, procedures, like voting. Voting does not make democracy. Believe me, any of us in the United States can attest to that. It's just a procedure. The spirit of equality, the spirit of caring deeply about each person, and this spirit of what does it mean to create opportunity for all, in many ways embedded in systems of education available to all. These are very deep ideas that are not easily substituted by simple mechanisms, and it's at stress around the world. So while our societies are very different and we all love the differences, we love being able to go from America to India, to China, to France, and really appreciate the extraordinary varieties of our different societies and cultures. At the same time, more than ever, we face common challenges. And that was very much part of the vision of Seoul, to create communities of learning that connect different institutions. And as you have here, different sectors, business, civil society, government, education, because in many ways we're more connected than ever, even though maintaining, nurturing, and honoring and appreciating those connections is, if anything, more difficult than ever. So we have common challenges. You received in your little journals these wonderful little cards that has been made up by the Seoul, France people. And one of the things I'm going to do just very briefly this morning, because there are quite a few people who are new, and I want to make sure that you have a little idea of some of the underlying core principles. And like any field, there's jargon. You know, you create distinctive language in any field, and easily jargon can separate people. Someone says a word and they think they know what it means, and somebody listens to them who knows what it means, and somebody else doesn't know what it means. And then all of a sudden there's a division. So this happens in all kind of communities of learning. You create terminology. So I want to say a few words about some of the key terms, particularly for the newcomers, so it doesn't kind of make you feel separate or distant.
And Peter, this is your life's work. Can you tell us, as you mentioned, the fifth discipline, what in your life journey has taken you to each one of those?
Yeah.
En français, peut-être? Peter, comme c'est vraiment un chemin de vie qui t'a amené à développer ces 5 disciplines, à les articuler. Donc, alors que tu nous les mentionnes, quel lien tu fais avec ton propre mouvement intérieur?
Sure. But of course, it's many people's life's work. One of the first things that got a little bit distorted in the growth of Seoul, and one of the reasons we focus so much on the Seoul community, the original 5th discipline book, there were 4 people writing, and the other 3 quit. So I ended up with 1 author. And it was always a bit of a misrepresentation, because the whole history and development of the ideas was collaboration. In 1980, we founded the Center for Organizational Learning at MIT. And that was really a network of a small number, about 6 or 7 initially, mostly companies working together. And out of that community really emerged the 5 disciplines. So all of this work has always emerged from collective activity. And of course, different of us have very strong personal connections. So the 5 disciplines didn't exist as a framework. We worked for many years around certain common tools. I'm an engineer. I'm a big believer in tools. So we had a lot of tools for systems thinking. That's my formal training. I came to MIT as a graduate student to study systems, interconnection, interdependence. So we always had a lot of tools for systems thinking. But pretty quickly we started to realize that you couldn't really study or learn about the system out there, our corporation, our industry, whatever you're looking at, without looking in here. Because the system is not just out there, it's out there and in here. The culture of any society, the culture of any organization lives inside of us. And internalized habits of thought and action, ways of being, ways of thinking. So the system is both outside and inside, and that led us to pretty quickly start to also talk about a term you'll hear often, mental models. My mentor at MIT, Jay Forster, who invented a field at MIT called system dynamics, in 1958, wrote about mental models. He said, the real change process is always in the assumptions, the worldviews. Later on, about 15 years later, one of the people who was part of that original organizational learning center is a gentleman from Shell, Royal Dutch Shell. I don't see him in the room right now. Ari? He's in the back? Oh, he's in the very, very back. Isn't that interesting? So Ari de Hus from Shell joined our group, and with that we started to learn how Shell had taken this idea and was using it as integral in their planning. All businesses, all managers have to plan. Usually most managers hate to plan. It involves budgeting and a lot of things like that that are kind of, you know, you just assume, let's get on with the work. But Ari was the first person who pointed out to me that the attitude that Shell had developed was that plans may be useful, maybe not useful. The world changes. Your plans don't sometimes. But the process of planning could always be useful if it helped managers think about their assumptions, their internalized picture of the world. All that we use the term mental models to represent is that each of us carries inside of us pictures of the world. No one has a company in their head. No one has a family in their head. No one has France in their head, or Paris, or French culture, or American society. But we have lots and lots of assumptions. And lots of habits, internalized ways of operating. These are what we've always called mental models. Habits of thought, habits of action, habits of feeling, internalized within us. So the paradox of all deep change is it's external and internal. Not one or the other, but the two are always connected. So the more we started to help people understand systems, we realized we also had to help them understand their own world, their own way of interacting and seeing that system. So that's the discipline of mental models. And it grows from the discipline of seeing systems or systems thinking. Lastly, there's one more kind of personal, individual discipline, which is this discipline of personal mastery. And that too arose in a very kind of logical progression. So starting off trying to understand complexity in systems, we realized that people always had to see their own internal system, their own mental models. But then the real question is, why do it? It's hard work. Bringing about deep change, bringing about systemic change is never easy. Whether it's a family, a team, an organization, or a society, it always takes time. It requires lots of effort. It requires, almost inevitably, living with lots of disappointment, because things never go as you would like. Why do any of that? Why would human beings venture into such a journey that's arduous and challenging? And the short answer that eventually became very obvious was because they care about something. The idea of vision has been in human kind of discourse for thousands of years. It became kind of a jargon term in the 1980s in management, and all of a sudden companies were all creating vision statements, and people said, oh, well, it's just management jargon. And my response to always that was, anything that's in the Old Testament of the Bible probably shouldn't be called jargon. You probably all know the phrase. It's from Proverbs. Where there is no vision, the people perish. This is not a new idea, and it's not just a Western Judeo-Christian idea. Around the world, you can find the same principle articulated in virtually all cultures. I've spent about a month a year for 2 decades in China. Believe me, the notion of vision is deeply embedded in Confucian traditional wisdom, as it is in native cultures where people typically will go on a vision quest during their ages of puberty as a way of connecting as a young adult to a deeper understanding of reality and a deeper understanding of me. What am I here to do? So we've always used this term vision very simply as a picture or an image of the future that you seek to create. It's not a fancy or esoteric term. All children have visions. At one point in our life, we didn't walk, but we had an aspiration to walk. We didn't ride a bicycle, but we had an aspiration to ride a bicycle. So vision turned out to be an absolutely essential additional element. Because without vision, the difficult journeys of change never occur. And it's natural, particularly today, but really in all times, to find ourselves consumed with reacting to problems. There always are difficulties. Any manager in any organization, whether it's a school or a business, has the problems of the moment, the crisis of the moment. And that's not good or bad, it's just life. The problem comes when all we're doing is reacting to problems. That's the problem. That's when leadership stops and reactive management starts. All we're doing is solving problems. It's a little bit like as a parent, right? We all know that the problems never stop. Right? Doesn't matter how old the children get, there's always some new problem. And it's easy to find ourselves consumed, again, with a mindset of one problem and another problem and then another problem and another problem, and just forget why this matters to us. Because to be a parent is to participate in the development of a human life. It's a visionary undertaking at its essence. And there's a lot of problems along the way. This loss of balance between dealing with problems and aspiring to create something we really care about is one of the greatest losses in any organization or in any society. So that's why vision became important. So the journey was really quite an organic one, starting with the systems perspective, realizing that we had to also have an internal as well as an external view, and that what would motivate the whole process could only be something that people truly care about creating. Lastly, we started to realize that there were both individual and collective aspects of all of this. So we had the discipline of mental models to point to the individual work of becoming more reflective, more open, more willing to see my own assumptions. But then that always has to be embedded collectively in teams, hence the notion of team learning, dialogue, the quality of conversation, which is a fundamental distinction between good teams and really poor teams. Can people really talk openly and effectively about difficult issues? Is there enough trust to say something that maybe is the wrong thing to say, to make mistakes, to kind of be able to engage in an ongoing conversation of learning? And lastly, in the domain of vision, of course, there's always the individual and the collective. The visions that ultimately matter to all of us are those that are shared. The only problem is you can't get shared visions without individual visions. They're sort of the soil within which shared visions can grow. So gradually we came to realize that in all these different domains, dealing with complexity, the inner and the outer, and the aspiration or visionary dimension, there was both an individual and collective dimension. And that's how we got to the 5 disciplines. So it was a complicated journey, but I make it very simple in hindsight.